Welcome back, everyone. So I'm Keith Dow, and I've been able to chat with you and connect with many of you through the course of this conference and in setting things up. And I'm a 5'10" white man, middle-aged now, I get to say, because I've passed that 40 mark, and I have a beard, a light brown beard with some graying hair, and I often wear glasses, but I'm wearing contacts today. So. I am thrilled and honored to welcome and introduce Sarah J. Melcher today, and I'm going to read her bio first, and you can find this in the plenaries and workshops description document. So Sarah is a professor emerita of Hebrew Scriptures at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. She holds a Ph.D. in Hebrew Bible from Emory University and an M.Div from Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. All right, and now we're going to get to her books. So get settled, because there's a number of them, and you probably recognize several. So Melcher was co-editor of and contributor to This Abled Body, Rethinking Disabilities in Biblical Studies, and editor and contributor to Discerning the Body, Metaphors of the Body in the Bible. It's 2014, the first one is 2007. In 2018, she published World Religions and the Environment and co-edited The Bible and Disability, a commentary with Mikeal C. Parsons and Amos Yong with Baylor University Press here. And so I know many of us are familiar with that one especially. I do encourage you to check out her most recent book, which is Prophetic Disability, Divine Sovereignty, and Human Bodies in the Hebrew Bible. And so that's available out here through Baylor University, and it was released in 2022. Melcher has published numerous articles on disability in the Bible, sexual practice in the Pentateuch, Jewish-Christian dialogue, and African-American biblical interpretation. She has worked as co-editor in collaboration with Amos Yong on a book series on studies in religion, theology, and disability for Baylor University Press. Sarah is a retired minister in the United Church of Christ in the Florida Conference. That's a lot. She has done a lot, and it is such a joy to have her here for her first Institute on Theology and Disability conference. And it's hard to believe, because her writing has shaped so much of this field and so much of the work that we've done. And it's just been wonderful to get to know Sarah. I had the privilege of working with her through the process of getting my book published, and she was great to work with through that process. And then the other perspective that we have this morning is kind of wrestling through sacred texts and just the different ways of approaching that, and her insights and her education have just really helped to bring those alive. So I'm excited to welcome her to the stage. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Keith, for that marvelous introduction. I hope I live up to it. I'm going to set my stopwatch, because once you get me started, there's no stopping me. And anyway, I go by the pronouns of she and her. I am a white woman. I'm a little on the short side with brown and gray curly hair. I am wearing a black and tan patterned capri and a black shell on top with a beige sweater. As far as age is concerned, I am a senior citizen, but that's all the closer you're going to get to that. Okay. Much of my talk today focuses on the chapter of Isaiah from my recent book, Prophetic Disability, Divine Sovereignty and Human Bodies in the Hebrew Bible. In the introduction to the book, I confess my admiration for the critical realist approach championed by Tom Shakespeare, an acclaimed scholar of disability studies. He describes his approach as eclectic and pragmatic in his study of disability. He uses a plurality of methods, really, allowing for complexity in the lived experience of disability. A critical realist approach acknowledges that human bodies exist independent of what is said about them. that is, independent from how they are identified. The approach does look at how the body relates to society and how disability is understood in that relationship. Critical realism allows for critical analysis of social structures and human agency, how they shape and reshape each other over time. And since critical realism allows for multiple methods and resources, critical realism, well, that'll be what I tried to adopt in this book. Critical realism raises the bar for the researcher because it's complex, but it may help not to indulge in reductionism. It may help us to keep the experience of disability intricate and broad in perspective. As Tom Shakespeare says about how he envisions these things, he says the experience of a disabled person results from the relationship between factors intrinsic to the individual and extrinsic factors arising from the wider context in which she finds herself. So disability is a result of the interplay between impairment and context or environment. And in addition to the influence of critical realism as an approach to the biblical text, I am also influenced by the ethicist Martha C. Nussbaum's capabilities approach, particularly the minimum core entitlements of what every citizen should have. And she articulates these in Frontiers of Justice. She critiques some modern conceptions of the social contract for their failure to deal adequately with the needs of citizens with impairments and/or disabilities. She argues that we must do better at recognizing the equal citizenship of people with disabilities. So I'm trying to give you a sense of my influences. Of course, I must acknowledge that an analysis of the Hebrew prophets is limited in applying the model of critical realism. In the study of the Hebrew Bible, our grasp of the historical, sociological, and cultural background is necessarily limited due to the gap of time, culture, and geography. Our primary source of information is the Bible itself. And I chose to talk about Isaiah today because it contains more references to disability than any other prophet. It especially focuses on imagery of blindness and deafness, as J. Blake Huey has pointed out. And the chapter about Isaiah in my book focuses primarily on two themes: disability and God's sovereignty or providence. Now, I don't know if you've wondered, how did a biblical scholar who's so stuck in the weeds, so, close to the text, how on earth did she get involved in disability studies in the Bible? And let me tell you just a little bit about that background, because maybe it'll help you to know what I'm up to. But I first got involved, Nancy Eastland was a friend of mine when I was in graduate school. And so she and I were having lunch one day, and she told me, I'm having a conference, a gathering of scholars who are going to speak about religion and disability. And I said, well, you're going to have somebody talk about Leviticus, aren't you? Because, Leviticus is quite a culprit in these matters. And she said, how would you like to present a paper on Leviticus? I said, okay. I was living in Leviticus because of my dissertation anyway. So I said, all right, I will. Since I presented that paper in a subsequent chapter of a book that Nancy and Don Salyers co-edited, I've never had to look for a place to publish about disability in the Bible. People have subsequently asked me to talk about those things. So I like to say that disability in the Bible was a vocation that found me, not one that I set out to do, if you will. So I'll try not to get too far into the weeds here, but I will talk about some specifics in the biblical text. In chapter 1 already, there's a clear framework for the rest of the book. And the first verse provides a brief introduction of the historical background of the 8th century prophet Isaiah. He uses familial language to confront the reader or listener with her or his violation of the covenant. The covenantal witnesses of heaven and earth are exhorted to pay heed to God's accusation of covenantal violation. God reminds the reader, listener, that they were raised as God's children, that Israel, child, has rebelled against God, parent, invokes covenantal language intentionally. The concept of rebellion, it echoes covenant terminology as well. So starting right away with verse 3 contends that an ox or donkey recognizes their master's sovereignty over them, but not so God's rebellious children of Judah. Verses 5 and 6 compare Judah's political situation to being thoroughly wounded or ill. As Rebecca Raphael points out, the Hebrew suggests that Judah has been beaten, presumably by God. The question is asked in the text why Judah would seek to be beaten further. God is portrayed as abusive in the very introduction to Isaiah. In response to Judah's so-called rebellion, the body is completely covered with wounds, a shocking image of the body politic, and strikingly symbolic of Judah's estrangement from God. Woundedness becomes synonymous with unfaithfulness. Later in the chapter, verses 16 through 18 call on the people to cleanse themselves, or God will do the cleansing. The implication is that God's cleansing may be harsh. After they cleanse themselves, they are instructed to enact justice for the widow and the orphan. God's holiness emphasizes divine sovereignty. God's holiness also creates a distance between the divine and human spheres. To approach holiness in any fashion, people must be cleansed. In chapter 2 and in other places in the book of Isaiah, the metaphor of God's ways and God's paths are rooted in the physical environs. People are exhorted to walk in the light of God. Elsewhere, corrupt leadership is portrayed in physical disability terms as leading people down wrong paths. That's chapter 3, verse 12. Chapter 2 is also important because of its description of God's sovereignty, God's power. In the future, nations stream to an exalted Mount Zion to learn about God. Weapons shall be turned into farming implements. Nations shall live at peace with God as sovereign over all. More mobility-oriented metaphors occur in chapter 3, where Jerusalem has stumbled and Judah has fallen. Judah's political issues are portrayed in physical terms, that the kingdom is unable to stay upright. Military defeat is depicted as someone lying on the ground. In some ways, feminine metaphors and disability metaphors are used in a similar fashion. To illustrate the arrogance of the people of Judah, the nation is described as haughty women who stretch their necks high, gaze wantonly on others, and tinkle when they walk, presumably from the anklets and earrings and various accessories that they wear. Only one verse describes the women's offenses. 10 verses describe the humiliation that God will inflict on these women. Feminine metaphors are used to indicate Judah's disobedience, the people's failure to live faithfully before God. Both metaphors of people with disabilities and those of women are used to depict Judah's distance from God. And Isaiah 4, the next chapter, continues the humiliation of women. The passage portrays 7 women begging one man, "Let us be called by your name. Take away our reproach." The passage speaks of the women's purification using menstrual uncleanness to picture moral impurity. Excuse me. This portrayal of a natural process to depict moral impurity is demeaning to women. And Isaiah 6, this just goes on, and I won't inflict you with all of it, I promise. Isaiah 6 famously uses bodily metaphor to portray the prophet's feelings of inadequacy. In verse 5, he says, "I am a man of unclean lips among a people of unclean lips." Later, the divine instruction reads, "Go and tell these people, hear but do not understand, see with its eyes and hearing with its ears, lest, seeing with its eyes and hearing with its ears, it would understand with its heart and turn and heal itself." Yeah, we're not after the people, in this instance, we're not after the people turning around and coming to God. From Rebecca Raphael's point of view, it is the speech of the prophet that causes impairment. Now, if we go to chapter 10 of Isaiah, God begins using Assyria as a tool to punish the people of Judah. Later, however, because of Assyria's arrogance, God strikes the nation with a wasting sickness. No one in their egotistical ventures should think of themselves as equal with God. God is sovereign. I would say the overarching, most important theme of Isaiah is talking about God's sovereignty. And when I went to have my ordination exams in front of the entire synod at that point, someone whispered in my ear as I went out, said, "The sovereignty of God." Remember, the sovereignty of God. So supposedly, if I was like Isaiah and stressed the sovereignty of God with every breath I could take, then I'd be okay and I'd be ordained. Anyway, I was ordained whether I focused entirely on that or not. Okay. It is problematic that the divine is pictured as causing serious disease among the people of Assyria. Blenkinsop notes that the passage also illustrates an important aspect of the message of Israel's prophets, the critique of imperialism and the refusal to take nationalistic and imperialistic pretensions seriously on their own terms. Isaiah 11, interestingly enough, downplays the role of the senses in making decisions, suggesting that the senses are not always reliable. The new king, mentioned in the passage, will not make decisions by means of the senses, but through the spirit of the divine will, to use discernment, wisdom, counsel, and strength. God will act righteously for the poor. The king will act righteously for the poor and arbitrate with equity for the humble of the land. So he's not to use his senses, but he's also portrayed as a physically strong actor who, with the rod of his mouth and the breath of his lips, will cause the death of wicked persons. The consequences of this king's reign, however, will be peace on God's holy mountain. Zion will be a safer place, and knowledge of God will spread throughout the land. Chapter 13 demonstrates how the people of Babylon will respond to God's awesome power. The hands of all will go limp, and the heart of every man will melt. It's not unusual for the Hebrew Bible to indicate a physical weakness or melting in response to God's efforts against a political enemy, or in response to Israel's warriors when they are supported by God and close at hand. Stricken with pain and agony, they will be in anguish like a woman in labor. The portrayal of physical weakness being linked to fear can be an unfortunate association for people with disabilities in cases where weakness is manifested as a feature of the disability. In chapter 14, God uses physical power to eliminate a serious threat against Israel. God's arm is poised to exert control over all the nations, enacting the divine plan for these peoples. The physical metaphors used in Isaiah 14 stress God's sovereignty over all. Assyria will experience brokenness directly because of God's mighty power. And now another theme that comes up frequently comes up in chapter 19, where the fear that Egypt experiences causes them to be like women, according to the biblical text. Some passages in the Hebrew prophets suggest that women are more prone to be fearful, or that it is a particularly feminine trait. 21, verse 3, combines the metaphors of disability and women to portray the Babylonians shrinking in fear at the idea that God would take action. Therefore, my loins are filled with anguish. Pangs have taken hold of me like the pangs of a woman in labor, too distressed to hear and too dismayed to see. It's worth noting that women's mortality rate in the process of giving birth was very high in ancient Israel. A lot of these metaphors that I'm talking about that I find demeaning to women and to people with disabilities, nevertheless are rooted in the historical and cultural situation of ancient Israel. And if you have a rate of mortality for women giving birth in the neighborhood of 50%, I think fear is a responsible way to respond to being in labor. But later on, the Babylonians are depicted as having a confused, stunned mind and shuddering in panic. And the prophet experiences temporary disability caused by fear, as Cooey noted. Now, getting into chapter 28. According to chapter 28, those who mock Isaiah's conveying of the word of God as simply precept after precept, law after law, they will walk but will fall backward. Once fallen, then they are subject to be broken, snared, and taken away. Those who fail to take God's message seriously will be subject to physical defeat. In verse 18 of chapter 28 suggests that these people will be struck by a scourge, which shall beat them down. These verses portray physical brokenness as punishment for disobedience. Chapter 29 uses metaphors of disability abundantly to imply that the people of Israel are not faithful and only give lip service to being devoted to God. God responds by making people confused. Later in chapter 29, God's sovereignty is rooted in the act of creation. God was the one who formed the human being, and the person formed should not call God's actions into question, nor God's understanding. Jeremy Skipper points out that healing of people with disabilities is part of a great environmental transformation in the prophetic eschatological text. And later in chapter 29, people with disabilities are associated with the poor and humble. And this is stereotypical. The power and plan of God is repetitively demonstrated through people with disabilities, who are objects of divine transformative power. And chapter 30 revisits a theme that we were already talking about, that people who are unable to stay on God's chosen path are unfaithful. Judah is presented as encouraging people to stray from the appointed path. Anyone who is not able to stay on the path is unable to adhere to God's guidelines for a faithful life. Elsewhere in chapter 30, God is seen as super powerful, an image that tends to make God appear inaccessible and creates distance between God and human beings. The intention, of course, is to convince the reader of God's sovereignty and power. And in Isaiah 32, 33, and 35, we see people that will experience transformation of their abilities. In chapter 32, they will be able to see and interpret well what they see. Their hearing will lead to understanding. The king and other leaders will enact justice and will pursue righteousness. The people will communicate clearly. And chapter 33 continues with metaphors of restoration and transformation. Metaphors of disability are used to illustrate how a righteous individual would behave. People with mobility problems will be able to share in any spoil, and no one in the land will be ill. Chapter 35, and I say that people with disabilities again serve as a foil to illustrate God's incredible restorative power. In the eschatological future envisioned by Isaiah 35, none will stray from the path, nor will ferocious animals be found upon it. Unless you would think of me as a Debbie Downer, and that all I see in the biblical text is, bad things about people everywhere. That's not completely true. I'm going to skip ahead to 3rd Isaiah. I have so much, that's a biblical scholar for you, so much detail. Where do I stop? Okay, 3rd Isaiah. Isaiah 56, verses 1 through 8, is a very inclusive text, reassuring eunuchs and foreigners that they can become full members of the Judean post-exilic community. According to verses 2 and 4, if one keeps the Sabbath, refrains from doing evil, and maintains the covenant, that is all that is required. Most relevant for our discussion is the inclusion of the eunuch. In ancient Judah, a man who was unable to reproduce, to father children, was considered to have a disability. This may reflect a conflict in the post-exilic community, since Ezra chapters 9 and 10 define the community more narrowly, as though those of pure lineage free from foreign influence. The less inclusive faction encouraged reproduction, but sought to define the next generation as descended from the exiles who have returned to Judah. In their desire to control reproduction, the eunuch did not fit their vision. And earlier passages, such as Deuteronomy 23, verse 2, and Leviticus 21:21, imply that some defects preclude a person's presence in the temple or prevents their presence as priests at the altar. Well, Isaiah 56 takes on the deeply embedded cultural imperative to reproduce. In verse 3, God exhorts the eunuch from calling himself a dry tree, a derogatory expression. God has a generous answer to the eunuch's self-defacement. For thus says Hashem, God, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast to my covenant, I will give in my house and in my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that will not be cut off. So let me go to some theological implications of some of the details in Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 1 suggests that God is like an abusive parent who beats the child over the entire body as a punishment for rebelliousness. Perhaps it would be useful to contrast this passage with Hosea 11, where God is portrayed as a parent who is unfailingly loving to the child. God recoils from causing harm and is filled with compassion. The unbreakable bond between God the parent and Israel the child prevails. And Isaiah 1 reminds us of the holiness of God and God's pursuit of justice. The nation was to purify themselves, to cease to do evil, and to learn to do good. Though verse 17 speaks for justice for the oppressed, the orphan, and the widow, these are representative figures, not an exhaustive list. This exhortation is in keeping with seeking justice for people with disabilities and for people of all genders. It shows a desire on the part of the author for people to uphold justice. Although God's holiness can enhance the distance between the divine realm and the human, the root meaning of the Hebrew term to be holy means to be set apart. People can be set apart to fulfill an expectation of God to serve in a particular capacity. Some people can be consecrated, made holy, to signify their calling to fulfill a special role. In Isaiah 1, perhaps the people were purified to pursue a divinely given task of enacting justice. Many passages in Isaiah, as I mentioned, speak of divine sovereignty. God in Isaiah is powerful and capable of transformation. But we all know that not everyone with a disability is healed by God. In fact, sometimes our disabilities are an integral part of us, inextricably intertwined with our identity. In Theology and Down Syndrome, Amos Yong retells the story of a woman with Down syndrome, and she asks if she will be healed when she gets to heaven. When her parents indicate that she will be healed, the woman asks, "But how will you know me then?" And that's found in Young's book, but also in Gaventa and Coulter from 2003. In speaking of the distance between the holy God and imperfect Israel, Isaiah 50, verse 8 declares, "The one who justifies me is near. Who will contend with me? Let us stand together. Who are my adversaries? Let them confront me." Numerous passages in the Hebrew Bible speak of the nearness of God, showing that God can be accessible. For example, see Psalm 73, verse 28. "But as for me, it is good for me to be near God. I have put trust in the Lord, that I may declare all your works." And of course, Isaiah 2 tells of God bringing peace among the nations. This chapter provides a vision of the future in which swords are turned into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. All the nations desire to learn from God. Certainly, this vision of peace offers future possibilities for people with disabilities and people of all genders. It is wise to remember that many disabilities are caused in war, and peace is certainly something to be sought. as noted earlier, equating moral failure, sinfulness, unfaithfulness, and military defeat with mobility impairment is difficult for anyone with a physical disability. Perhaps biblical passages such as Isaiah 40, verse 11, can counter the more difficult passages. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms and carry them in his bosom and gently lead the mother sheep. There are numerous passages in Isaiah and the other prophets that emphasize God's compassion and the impetus to care, the providential aspect of God. An interesting idea to consider when analyzing Isaiah's metaphors of women and people with disabilities is Carol Fontaine's theory that feminine gender was a disability in the ancient world. In these passages of Isaiah, women and people with disabilities share a reduced status in the perspective of these authors. This may reflect a cultural situation in ancient Israel where women were considered as second-class citizens of reduced status according to societal standards. In regard to the portrayal of God healing some disabilities and not others, Hans Reinder's approach to providence is worthy of our consideration. He states, and I quote, "Providence, to cut a long story short, is about how the love God sends into our lives guides us in discovering a new self, the self that finds itself on the other side of the chasm, and in that sense is transformed to receive a new future. This is the provision God makes through the presence of the Spirit." Unquote. Of course, the portrayal of foreign armies as having superhuman strength, given the juxtaposition of Judah with weakness or disability, is problematic. It is one thing to envision the deity as possessing extreme power. It is another thing entirely to depict human beings in that fashion. Better to follow Deborah Beth Kramer's lead in her book, Disability and Christian Theology, Embodied Limits and Constructive Possibilities, and recognize that part of being human is to have limitations. And she published that in 2009. Now, I did claim that I was influenced by Martha Nussbaum's values for quality of life. And one of the things she stresses is to have bodily integrity, to be free of assault from others. Well, God seems to have a propensity in Isaiah to assault the people as punishment. As we know, assault can cause disability. To portray God as abusive can be a trigger for those whose abusive treatment has caused disability. And one more thought about the metaphor of stumbling or falling because of rebelliousness. It is very important to counter such attributes with the idea that people with disabilities are no more or less righteous than others. And that's something I learned from Nancy Eastland. She once said to me, "I am so annoyed that people keep talking about how brilliant I am." She said, "Yes, I wrote a book." And apparently people would also say, "How did you manage to write a book when you have this disability?" And she said, "I wrote a book. People write books." So she did not like being either to be made a hero or as someone who overcame her disability. And people just wanted to put her in that category, according to what she told me. And here's an interesting question that comes up for me when I read the prophets and look at issues of disability. According to many prophetic passages, the people were under great pressure to adhere to God's will. Did they really have a choice? That's what occurs to me. The tactics displayed do not create the impression that people turned or returned to the God of Israel out of free choice. You know, if you didn't turn to God and be faithful to God, you would be punished with a scourge or pushed. At any rate, there are many passages that speak of people returning to Judah after being in exile, and some of those passages talk about that people with disabilities will lead the procession to return. And it's interesting, Jeremy Skipper points out that in some of those passages, the people are not healed in order that they can lead the way, but somehow God makes accommodations, making it possible for people with disabilities to return to Judah. In some cases, the people with disabilities, those metaphors are erased from the texts in Isaiah, that they become cured of their disabilities, supposedly, before they undertake the journey to go back to Judah. And I don't like those passages. There are a couple of reasons why. And I do think, as a biblical scholar, it's really okay for me to say, I don't like that biblical passage. I struggled with that for a while, but not for long. At any rate, these depictions assume that people with disabilities couldn't manage to find their way back on their own. And I don't like that. I think, you know, people with vision impairment, they find a way to get around, and they find the places that they need to go. So I think that it's somewhat demeaning to picture that only through God and only through healing that people can return to the land. There's a lot more. I'm going to have to refer you to my book, I'm afraid, but you thought I'd do that, right? But anyway, I did also write about Ezekiel and Jeremiah and the book of the 12. And there are some differences, but many of them do the same things over and over again that we see in Isaiah. At any rate, I thank you very much for inviting me to come here. I don't know how it is that I haven't been to the Institute before. Go figure. Anyway, thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, I think we have some time here for questions and discussion, and you're willing to engage some folks here. So
please ask me
we have Topher online as well, so if you're joining us online, you're welcome to submit questions in the chat, or we can also unmute you and have you join us here.
Sarah, thank you, for one. The kind of pervasiveness of the metaphors is something that I hadn't quite realized. But I know Jeremy did this, but Jeremiah talks about people with disabilities and going back to Jerusalem with the group, right? Does Isaiah also do that? Or do the people have to be healed first?
In some cases, the people are healed before they return, and as part of God's eschatological transformation of earth and people, so that Jerusalem is then exalted as God's holy place. But in some cases, they are not healed.
Okay.
And Jeremy Skipper was very good about pointing that out, that it's not a blanket thing where people are always healed before they return to the land.
Right. And one other question, What's your take? I read his book a long time ago now, but it's all about this suffering servant and the images of disability in that chapter in Isaiah.
Well, you know what? I skipped over that because I didn't want to overwhelm people, but let me refer to that if I may. Now, Skipper has argued that Isaiah 53 portrays the servant as disabled. Isaiah 53 implies that the God of Israel causes the servant's disability. God appears to strike the servant. I mean, the language in Hebrew is of striking the servant with disability. Now, some people with disabilities and their allies struggle with the theological premise that God causes disability. Even in Julia's presentation this morning, the passage in Exodus 4 where God says, well, who makes someone deaf? Who makes someone blind? Is it not I, God? And that's a troublesome passage to me. That God causes disability. I prefer to think in terms that it's a random occurrence. So I guess I've been influenced by science in thinking more that disability is a random thing, and sometimes it's caused by accidents. So Isaiah 53 verse 5 suggests that a person might be stricken with a disability in order to atone for other people's sins. And this seems innately unfair to me, that someone would be given a disability to atone for other people. The servant with disabilities is portrayed as oppressed and afflicted, yet remains silent in the face of this. It could be read as encouraging people with disabilities to acquiesce to oppression and discrimination, to remain silent. And I'm sure the disability activists out there will bristle at this idea, preferring to press on to achieve full equality. While the servant brings redemption to the community, nevertheless, the servant deserved a life that satisfied his own needs and desires, as any person with a disability deserves a satisfying life. So is there more I can tell you about my take on that? Okay.
Wonderful.
Please, more questions. Anne?
We have one back here first, maybe. And do we have anything online, Topher? Or okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, for this insightful presentation. What struck me is that you presented the text in order as in a way as if they are all on the same level. And I wonder what you would think about different takes on the books of the prophet, and not only those. For example, Isaiah, where people would say, Old Testament scholars would say, well, perhaps we should think more about them as a collection of voices who claim to be Isaic, and it would create the possibility of seeing different texts and different types of references to God, punishment, disability, and that as responses to one another.
Yes.
And I would like you to comment on that idea.
I like that idea. Biblical scholars, we tend to think that that's how these different books came into being, that really they are a collection of observations from different times and by different people. And because of a certain quality of the text, they are lumped together. And Isaiah is a really strong example of that, because ever since the 19th century or even before, biblical scholars have said that Isaiah really reflects three distinct historical backgrounds. And Isaiah chapters 1 through 39, roughly, there are exceptions within that, but they're from the time of the 8th century prophet, or at least reflect that Isaiah. Chapters 40 through 55 are thought to be from the period of the Babylonian exile. And chapters 56 through 66 are thought to reflect time that's post-exilic, after the people return to the land. So it's interesting to me that within the biblical text, as I mentioned with Isaiah 56, that it contradicts what's in Ezra chapters 9 and 10. So when people pound their pulpits and talk about, well, the biblical text says, well, which biblical text? And so I love Isaiah 56 because it counters this idea that reproduction is the highest thing that a person can do. I never gave birth to a child myself, so I really like that passage. I have wonderful stepchildren, but the eunuch, a person regarded as having a disability in ancient Israel, they say if you're faithful, if you keep the covenant, you're in, man. And God says, I'll give you something that's better than having children. I'll give you a reputation that will never be taken away from you. So, yeah, I think, and within Isaiah 1 through 39, there are texts from different periods with different perspectives. So, and maybe that's why I get into the weeds so much, where I say what every individual passage in Isaiah has to say about disability, which is a bit much. There is a lot of variety. There's a lot of diversity. And I'm not one who wants to throw out the baby with the bathwater, because there are things about the book of Isaiah that I find inspiring, to be honest. I'm probably saying too much. Please.
Can I follow up
Yeah.
a little bit on this? So the classical Old Testament scholarship was to find these blocks of text that supposedly belong together. And if there was a kind of a text that clearly doesn't fit, it must have been from a different source.
Right.
Or else you can only conclude that Isaiah was a pretty much confused guy. Which we usually don't, and the Old Testament scholars definitely did not. So they attributed deviating text from different sources. But of course, that leaves the interesting question: why and then are they put together at some point as belonging to one book, or at least one voice? And that's, if you think that's a pertinent question, then the possibility exists that these texts are responding to one another, which presupposes that the debates that bring us to be attracted to this text rather than the other are not only contemporary, but they have been around also in Old Testament communities, which is the reason why texts respond to one another and also contradict one another. Do you think that is a sensible way of looking at this?
Oh, yes, I think it's a very sensible way of looking at it. Even within sections in Isaiah, there's differences in perspective. I think the things that make people see something in common in the book of Isaiah are the treatment of Zion, the focus on the people and God being holy and being concerned about justice. Some of those things carry over throughout the book. And so I think that these things may have been gathered together because they had a commonality among them, even though they disagreed. Wonderful thing about the Bible is lots of passages don't agree with one another. And it reflects a diversity of perspectives, a diversity of historical and sociological backgrounds, and it's endlessly fascinating to people like me. Other questions, please? Anne?
So, yes, thank you very much, Sarah, for this. So I guess No, like as a Catholic, what we tend to like hold things in tension, and and I'm just wondering also because clearly you love exploring the scripture, right? You're spending a lot of time in it, and so where do you find hope to as you bring, dwelling on the problematic passages regarding persons with disabilities and women, but where do you find the hope for it? Is that it sort of builds on what Hans was saying, but in in a different way?
I think there are hopeful passages in Isaiah. My favorite example today is Isaiah 56. Tomorrow it may be Isaiah 40. I don't know. But also my own personal experience is what colors my view of the Bible. And that is, I feel that it was I'm a recovered alcoholic, sober 42 years, thereabouts. And I think a lot of it had to do with my turning to a higher power and asking for help, and also attending AA meetings. And I don't say that as an aside. But the spiritual aspects of Alcoholics Anonymous fascinated me, drew me in, and I credit the Spirit with my recovery. And I've been having a pretty darn happy life since then. So I do see the positive things in the book of Isaiah. But I also have some certain commitments of my own. You probably gathered that I consider myself to be a feminist. I want to be a disability advocate. So those things do show up in my writing. I care about other religions and their desires to express themselves. I wrote a book, as Keith pointed out, on world religions and the environment. I had to work hard on that one because it didn't come naturally to me. I'm a Hebrew Bible scholar, but nevertheless, I cared about those things. So you can see that reflected in my research, that I don't come to it in a non-biased fashion. I have things that I care about, and I pursue biblical scholarship in that fashion. I try not to read things into the text, like put my own agenda into the text, but rather I look for those things that resonate with what I believe.
So maybe the question I mean to ask is, which texts would you go to in Hebrew scripture that you find more affirming?
I brought up Hosea 11 today. That is a terrific passage, and it's just that apparently God thinks that a divorce might be forthcoming with Israel, but rejects the idea. God says, look, Israel was a child, and I loved Israel. I lifted Israel to my cheek, and I can't divorce Israel. I can't. So there are mixed metaphors there of Israel as a child or Israel as a wife. But the upshot of the whole passage is, I can't reject Israel. I love these people. And so I'd say Hosea 11 is a really good passage it preaches.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Something that occurred to me as Hans was speaking is like these passages, if they're different authors kind of talking to each other with different understandings. Kenny, what occurred to me is it seems like that maybe the more harsh black and white negative stuff is a lower level of like moral maturity and faith development. If you look at like Kohlberg's theory and Fowler with that, and I'm wondering kind of if we interpret these things just like when Moses was having more of his inner ableism, maybe that was a lower level of maturity than when he was speaking in his authenticity, like we heard this morning. Maybe part of this looking at it as this is how it looks when we're in that stage one, black and white, good or bad kind of thinking, and as people mature, they're able to see different kind of aspects in a more inclusive way.
Okay. These are ancient people that wrote these texts. And their vision of God is not necessarily my vision of God, although I do find hope in some of these things. And I think life was much more precarious at that time. I mentioned women's mortality rate in giving birth was very high. Infants, children, high infant mortality rate in ancient Israel. That's one reason why these texts exhort people to have lots and lots of children, is because we need people to work the fields. We need people to do the planting and that agricultural community, and they needed lots of children to make a go of it, people who could work. And because of the mortality, it was a problem. But we read those texts today, and with the population explosion and the threat to the environment and those things, it doesn't sound right to us, this, have children, have many. And those passages that say men could have multiple partners, but women better not do that. Those things don't resonate with us today. So, but in some ways, some of these passages are surprisingly mature, surprisingly resonant still today. And that's why I keep reading these things and I keep studying these things, because some of them resonate with me. And I loved what Julia Watts-Belzer said about part of our task is to get into these difficult texts in the tradition that have not been helpful to people with disabilities, and to study them and to interpret them. So I said I was kind of Debbie Downer with my focus on these negative texts, but I think that's part of my task, is to recognize those passages and to help people not to accept them blindly, if that makes sense.
Wonderful. Well, we'll take one more question here from Father Matthew.
As you were talking, I started thinking, and you're talking about the different ways of healing or being part of the community and whether the disabled people are healed or not. For whatever reason, an image was coming to my mind of Lourdes, France, where they have the spring where like a bunch of people who've had cancer, who've had other things where like they're in a wheelchair and then they miraculously come out and they aren't. But the majority of people who go there with something like that are not physically healed. But a very large number of them talk about a spiritual healing where they feel like God has lifted that burden of suffering, that burden of, whether it's the cancer or whatever other, or more of a disability, because cancer is more of, I don't know if cancer really qualifies disability per se, but some kind of thing like that. Now, I don't know if that might be related to kind of those who are welcomed back into the community in ancient Israel, or whether that's almost like a third category between those who are just welcomed back to the community as they are, and those who are cured in a physical, medical sense, those who feel like a curing and a cleansing from God, but still have that disability or whatever else, but they feel like kind of an internal cleansing, or whether that's just completely unrelated with Isaiah. I'm not sure. That was kind of the thought that was coming to my mind.
And there's a diversity of opinions. Thank you, Matthew, for that. There are diversity of opinions reflected in the biblical text. Some people are accepted back into the community without being changed, without necessarily... a lot of the passages do assume that they've had a spiritual change of heart, that they are now willing to turn to God and to follow God's path and to do God's will. So there are passages that say that, but there are some that are not explicit about any healing or transformation of personality or anything that these people undergo. And I'm not a complete skeptic about healing. I shared my story that I'm a recovered alcoholic. I don't think I did that on my own. Faced with my own capabilities, I probably would still be drunk, which I am not. But I believe God had a hand in my recovery. And so I'm not one to poo-poo the idea that some people are healed, but many are not.
Hello, hello. Okay, we have one more from online, it looks like.
Okay.
I want to say thank you to the keynote speaker for helping me to learn so many nuances of Isaiah. And that's not a book that I spend a lot of time in because it's so complicated. So thank you for that. And just I wanted to respond to the topic of the hope of Isaiah or the hope in the Hebrew Testament. And one of the things that I really like about Isaiah is the theology of access, where it says the mountains will be made low and the valleys made high and the paths made smooth. I know that really resonates with me using a power wheelchair, and I hope that it resonates with others in the room as well. And it's really great to see so many people that I love at ITV. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I too love the idea of God being accessible. And so, although there are texts that work against that idea, there are some that seem to fully understand that God is there, God is accessible, etc.
Wonderful. Well, I appreciate the way that you've complexified some of these passages for us and really engaged honestly with them as well. I think that's so important. And also just the way that you've shared your journey and how encouraging that is to hear as well. So